She wasn't supposed to carry a weapon. Hell, she was meant to stay far from the action. Her job was simple: watch, take notes, and report on what the elite operatives were doing in the field. But when America's top sharpshooters kept missing their targets, when an entire SEAL team found themselves trapped by an enemy they couldn't locate, she did something that turned the tide. She stepped into that death zone alone and made every shot hit its mark. Before I dive into what really went down that day, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Alright, let's dive in. The Jeeps belched diesel fumes before going quiet along the hillside. The Iraqi sun was already punishing at 0800 hours, turning metal hot enough to sear skin and making the air shimmer like shattered glass. The valley below gaped like a wound, all jagged rock and shadowed caves that looked like hollow eyes staring back. Wind came in razor-sharp gusts, carrying the metallic tang of scorched stone and pushing dust devils across the valley floor in lazy spirals, then fading, then returning from a new angle. The kind of wind that made snipers swear and double-check their data cards. Captain Elena Carter stepped down from the second truck, boots finding grip on stone that threatened to slip. Mid-30s, unremarkable in the way career military learned to be. Standard plate carrier, M4 slung tight, compact binoculars hanging against her vest. No long rifle, no fancy optics, nothing that screamed operator. What was unusual wasn't what she carried, but how she moved. While others shifted against the gusts, she stood perfectly still, head tilted like someone listening to music only she could hear. Chief Ethan Cole hit the ground running, then scanned the high ground while his team unloaded. At 42, he moved with the controlled aggression of someone who'd earned his trident by making the right decisions in places where wrong ones got you shipped home in aluminum boxes. His SEALs spread out with casual efficiency. No drama, no shouted orders, just placement sectors and that particular silence before work began. The sniper element peeled off toward a serrated outcrop, offering clean angles into the valley. Only then did Cole glance at their uninvited guest. "You got what you need, Captain." Professional neutrality, but his eyes said he'd been doing this job before headquarters started sending observers. "I do," Elena Carter replied. Simple. No explanation. Petty Officer Diaz shouldered past with a laser rangefinder. He didn't lower his voice when he muttered, "Perfect. Brass sent us a desk jockey to watch us work." Elena ignored him completely. She moved behind a spine of fractured rock and raised her binoculars, scanning the valley with systematic precision. Through her glass, the pass resolved into layers. Pale talus spilling down like sand, darker limestone where caves cut back, an old riverbed stitched with stubborn tamarisk. But it was the air itself that held her attention. Heat was already clawing up from sun-baked stone, making the far slope dance. Every 20 seconds the wind would snap east to west, pause, then return with a different edge. She watched the dust patterns and counted under her breath. The valley was breathing sideways. Up on the outcrop, Staff Sergeant Hayes opened his rifle case like a surgeon unveiling instruments. His spotter Lopez called ranges. For 20 to the left cave mouth, 680 to that scrub cluster. Winds 26, occasionally bumping 3. Below, figures moved along the far gully with casual confidence. Not shepherds. They carried rifles too comfortably. They paused in the open just long enough to make everyone hold their breath, then melted into shadows. "We catch them moving between holes. We own this pass," Cole said. Hayes settled against his rifle. "Easy pickings if this wind behaves." Tight laughter answered, the kind that sounded like confidence if you didn't listen carefully. Nearby, Elena Carter tracked heat distortions through her binoculars. Rivers of warped air that bent light like water. Sound carried strangely here. Echoes bouncing back on delay. She made no announcement of these observations, just continued her methodical sweep. On the spur, safeties clicked off with metallic whispers. Cloth rasped against stone as bodies settled into shooting positions. Hayes found his natural respiratory pause and let the world narrow to the circle of his scope. "On my mark," Cole said, voice pitched just loud enough to carry to his scattered team. "We clean the lane, then push the rescue element. Elena lowered her binoculars just enough to watch heat shimmer rise from the far slope in waves that looked almost liquid. The wind gusted once, held steady for a heartbeat, then shifted. She breathed with it, timing the rhythm, her expression unreadable as carved stone. Around her, the seals settled into that thin electric stillness that comes just before the first shot shatters a silence that was never peaceful to begin with. The targets reappeared at 0830, moving in loose patrol formation. 2 became 3, then 5. A full squad picking their way through broken terrain with practiced economy. Each fighter carried his weapon with casual competence that made Cole's jaw tighten. Range 650, Lopez called. Target-rich environment, heading for the cave cluster. Hayes's breathing slowed. Wind 26, holding right edge. The rifle cracked like a branch, snapping. The sound rolled across the bowl and came back, changed, stretched thin. Dust jumped 3 feet short of the lead fighter's boots. "Miss," Lopez said flatly. Hayes cursed and worked his bolt. He'd been shooting this range since 18. The wind call was solid, the dope perfect, and the target was standing like he was waiting for a bus. He fired again. The round sparked off limestone to the left. The fighters scattered with fluid discipline. "That's 2, Cole muttered, edge creeping into his voice. From another hide, Staff Sergeant Bennett opened up. The crack echo rhythm doubled as both snipers worked their bolts. High then low, left, then right. Bullets sang off stone, but none hit flesh. "For shots," Cole said through gritted teeth. "They know we're here." The SEALs worked frantically, recalculating holds. Lopez tracked gusts with his weather meter, sweat cutting tracks through dust on his face. "Thermals are spiking," he hissed. Drafts pushing opposite directions like shooting through a washing machine. That's when Elena Carter spoke up, voice calm as someone reading weather. "You're shooting into a thermal funnel." The gusts split. One draft climbs, one falls. Every round's walking in 2 directions. Hayes cut her a look that could strip paint. "We'll adjust. Don't need a lecture from the peanut gallery." Elena returned to her binoculars, watching heat distortions writhe over darker stone. Through her glass, enemy fighters flickered, solid one moment, dissolving into shimmers the next. Another shot cracked. The bullet whined off into empty air, striking 20 feet above target. Sharp chatter of AK-47s answered. The fighters were moving with intent now, rifles up, seeking firing positions. Cole felt the moment slipping away from him like water through his fingers. He'd led men through Fallujah, through the mountains of Pakistan, through night raids where the smallest mistake could get everyone killed. But this wasn't urban combat or a close-quarters battle. This was precision work. And his precision shooters were throwing rounds like they were back on the qualification range having a bad day. Return fire escalated fast. Controlled bursts walked up the slope. Rock dust exploded across the SEALs' positions, chips stinging exposed skin. "They're bracketing us," Diaz said. "Listen, mortar tubes." The distinctive thunk-thunk rolled across the pass. "Incoming!" Cole roared. The first round hit wide, throwing up a geyser of dirt on the opposite ridge. The second fell short, but the third arced in with accuracy that made everyone's blood run cold. Hayes rolled away, blood streaming from shrapnel cuts. The corpseman was already moving, but his face carried the tight expression of bad math. Another mortar cut off Cole mid-sentence, close enough to shower them with pebbles. Lopez clutched his shoulder where Stone had opened him up. Down in the valley, figures darted between positions with the kind of coordinated movement that spoke of months of rehearsal. For every enemy they glimpsed, 2 more were already repositioning. The ambush was unfolding like a piece of music, each part perfectly timed to complement the others. "We need to move," Diaz hissed. But even as he said it, he knew it was impossible. The wounded couldn't be carried fast enough, and the route down from their ridge was exposed to every enemy position in the valley. They weren't retreating anywhere. They were pinned. Elena Carter had slid lower against her cover, binoculars steady despite the chaos erupting around her. While the seals cursed and bled, she continued tracking the patterns below. How one firing position would suppress the ridge while another repositioned. How the mortar crew was using pre-plotted coordinates to walk their fire closer with each salvo. "They're not scattered," she said quietly, almost to herself. "They're layered." Cole heard her despite the noise and turned, face streaked with dust and frustration. "What did you say?" For the first time since they'd arrived, she looked directly at him instead of through her optics. "Interlocking fields of fire. Whoever planned this knows exactly where you'd set up. They've drilled this scenario." As if to prove her point, another mortar thumped in the distance. This one landed close enough that the shock wave knocked loose equipment from the rocky ledges and sent several seals scrambling for new cover. Cole stared at her, processing the implications. He'd walked into textbook ambushes, fought his way out of kill zones from Tikrit to Kandahar. But this felt different. This felt like someone had studied American tactics, learned how SEAL teams operated, and built a trap specifically designed to eat them alive. And the quiet woman with the binoculars, the one his team had dismissed as a desk-writing observer, was reading the enemy's playbook like she'd helped write it. The situation deteriorated with the kind of mechanical precision that made seasoned operators start thinking about last letters home. Another mortar burst shook the ridge hard enough to crack stone, sending fragments whining through the air like angry hornets. The wounded were accumulating faster than the corpsmen could treat them, and ammunition counters were dropping toward numbers that made squad leaders nervous. Hayes, his right arm wrapped in blood-soaked gauze, tried to work his bolt left-handed and nearly dropped his rifle. "I can't hold zero like this," he admitted through gritted teeth. Bennett had moved to a backup position, but his shots were still going wide. High when he compensated for thermal lift. Low when he tried to account for the tricky winds. "It's like the air down there is made of liquid," he said, frustration cracking his professional composure. That's when Elena Carter did something that made everyone stop what they were doing and stare. She set her binoculars neatly on the stone beside her with the kind of careful precision someone might use when placing a pen after signing important documents. Then she unslung the compact rucksack from her hip and drew out a weapon that definitely hadn't been listed on any manifest. It wasn't standard military issue, compact black with the kind of suppressor that suggested someone had put serious thought into not advertising their presence. Custom modifications showed years of use, not abuse, but the kind of where that came from a tool being employed by someone who understood its capabilities completely. She racked it once, the sound clean and mechanical, then checked the chamber with movements that spoke of muscle memory carved deep by repetition. Cole saw it and felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Captain, you're not authorized to carry that weapon." Her gaze met his, calm under the grit and smoke drifting across their position. "Neither are they," she said, nodding toward the muzzle flashes winking from the valley below. "But they're still shooting at us." She moved into a firing position with the fluid economy of someone who'd done this more times than she could count. No fumbling with bipods or adjustments. No consulting range cards or wind meters, just body to ground, cheek to stock, breathing already measured and controlled. Through her scope, the valley resolved differently than it had through the SEAL's optics. She wasn't chasing movement or trying to track running figures. She was watching the distortions, where heat bent the air in telltale patterns, where dust settled in ways that revealed hidden positions, where shadows shifted without wind to move them. 2 o'clock midslope behind the boulder cluster, she murmured, voice conversational despite the chaos around them. She made a slight adjustment to her scope, clicked twice to the left to account for the valley's peculiar wind patterns, then settled into her natural respiratory pause. The suppressed crack was barely audible over the ongoing firefight. But down in the valley, a figure who'd been preparing to launch another RPG suddenly pitched forward and didn't get back up. Diaz blinked hard, unsure of what he'd just witnessed. What the hell? Elena Carter was already transitioning, scope sweeping to acquire another target. She found it in the shimmer of heat rising from sun-warmed stone, a fighter who thought he was invisible behind a natural screen of distorted air. Her second shot was as precise as the first. The man crumpled without ever knowing where death had come from. Lopez, despite the blood seeping through his bandages, couldn't help but whisper what everyone was thinking. "Holy, who is this woman?" Elena's finger found the trigger reset, her tone as level as if she were calling out range estimates. "The person keeping you alive." Another round, another enemy fighter down. And for the first time since the ambush began, the SEALs felt the balance of the fight shifting in their favor. Not because of superior numbers or heavier weapons, but because someone they'd written off as a liability was systematically dismantling the trap that had been built to kill them. The tactical situation shifted so fast it gave everyone whiplash. One moment, the SEALs were pinned down, bleeding and running low on options. The next, their observer was methodically erasing enemy positions with the kind of clinical precision that made professionals take notice. Elena Carter worked her way through targets with mathematical efficiency. Each shot was deliberate, calculated, final. Where Hayes and Bennett had struggled with thermal distortions and tricky winds, she seemed to read the air itself, compensating for invisible currents with adjustments so subtle they looked like instinct. A machine gunner who'd been suppressing their left flank suddenly went silent. Elena had put a round through his chest at 400 meters, shooting through heat shimmer that would have fooled most scopes. An RPG team preparing to bracket their position found themselves one man short when her bullet found the loader as he bent to retrieve another rocket. The SEALs, stunned into temporary silence by the display of marksmanship, began to find their rhythm again. Diaz called out corrections to his shooters, but now they were following Elena's lead instead of trying to improvise solutions to problems she'd already solved. "Target cave mouth, 3 o'clock, Cole said, spotting movement in the shadows. "I see him," Elena replied. She waited, patient as stone, until the fighter shifted just enough to expose his shoulder. The suppressed crack was followed immediately by the distinctive sound of a weapon clattering against rock as lifeless fingers released their grip. Bennett, his confidence returning with every enemy position that went silent, managed his first solid hit of the day, a fighter who'd exposed himself while trying to relocate after Elena had eliminated his partner. Finally, he muttered, working his bolt with renewed purpose. But the enemy wasn't done. The survivors began to adapt, using smoke and coordinated movement to complicate targeting solutions. A white phosphorus grenade burst on the valley floor, creating a screen of dense smoke that obscured entire sections of the battlefield. "They're adjusting," Diaz observed, tracking movement through his spotting scope, trying to mask their repositioning. Elena never stopped scanning. Even when smoke obscured visual contact, she watched the patterns. How the white clouds moved in the valley's irregular winds, were they thin enough to reveal glimpses of movement, how sound carried differently through the chemical haze, a muzzle flash flickered through the smokescreen for just a fraction of a second. Most shooters would have missed it, dismissed it as imagination or optical illusion. Elena Carter put a round exactly where the flash had originated. The smoke swirled, revealing a figure falling backward into the rocks. "Impossible shot," Hayes muttered, watching through his scope despite his wounded arm. "She's shooting ghosts." The mortars had gone quiet, not because they were out of ammunition, but because Elena had systematically eliminated the forward observers who'd been calling in corrections. Without spotters to walk the rounds onto target, the mortar crews were reduced to firing blind into empty ground. What had started as a perfectly orchestrated ambush was collapsing into chaos. The enemy's careful positioning and interlocking fields of fire meant nothing when their key personnel kept disappearing behind precisely placed bullets. Each loss created gaps in their coverage, and Elena exploited those gaps with the ruthless efficiency of someone who understood that in this business there was no such thing as a fair fight. The turning point came when she identified the enemy commander, a figure who'd been directing movement from a concealed position high on the valley's eastern wall. He'd made the mistake of using a radio, and the brief reflection off his antenna had given him away. The shot was nearly impossible, 600 meters through shifting thermals across a wind that was gusting erratically at a target partially concealed behind natural cover. Elena took her time, breathing with the rhythm of the valley itself, letting her crosshairs settle with the patience of someone who knew that some opportunities only came once. When she fired, the enemy's coordinated movement fractured. Without central command, their tactical discipline began to unravel. Individual fighters started making decisions based on fear rather than training. And fear made them predictable. The SEALs sensed the change immediately. What had felt like fighting in a cage suddenly opened up into possibilities. They began to maneuver, using suppressive fire to cover movement, working angles they'd been denied for the past hour. "They're breaking," Cole said. And there was something like awe in his voice as he watched decades of combat experience being rewritten by one woman with a rifle. But Elena Carter wasn't finished. She had identified something that made her blood run cold, a secondary position where two figures were setting up what looked like a heavy sniper rifle. The kind of weapon that could reach out and touch the helicopter landing zone where their extraction was planned. She couldn't let that weapon come online, not with wounded men depending on getting out alive. Without announcing her intentions, she broke cover. The enemy fire intensified the moment Elena left the relative safety of the ridge. Rounds cracked past her head and sparked off the rocks at her feet as she bounded down the slope, using terrain features for cover, moving with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of someone who'd learned to read ground under fire. The SEALs watched in fascination and horror as their observer transitioned from precision shooter to assault element in the space of a heartbeat. She flowed between positions like water, finding the path of least resistance, never staying exposed for more than a second, never moving in straight lines that enemy shooters could predict. "Cover her," Cole roared, though his team was already sending suppressive fire into every muzzle flash they could identify. The ridge erupted with the controlled fury of professional soldiers doing what they did best, making life extremely difficult for anyone stupid enough to shoot at Americans. Elena reached her first waypoint, a cluster of boulders that provided cover from most angles, and immediately transitioned to her sidearm. The compact pistol appeared in her hands as if it had materialized there, and she put two controlled pairs into a fighter who'd been trying to flank her position. The man dropped without ever getting a clear shot. She moved again, this time angling toward the natural chimney where the heavy weapon was being assembled. The approach was treacherous, loose stone that could betray her position, angles that exposed her to fire from multiple directions. Any rational person would have called for backup, waited for air support, or found another way to deal with the threat. Elena simply accepted the risk as part of the solution. She gained another 20 meters before a burst of automatic fire forced her behind a narrow ridge of stone, barely wide enough to conceal her profile. Bullets whined overhead, fragmenting against the rock and showering her with sharp debris. A normal person might have been pinned there, trapped between cover and catastrophe. Instead, she pulled a fragmentation grenade from her kit. The throw was perfect, a high arc that cleared the intervening rock and landed precisely where geometry and trajectory dictated it should. The explosion echoed across the valley like thunder. And when the dust settled, the heavy weapon position was silent. But the enemy had one more surprise waiting. A fighter she hadn't seen, hadn't even known was there, rose from a spider hole barely 10 feet away, AK-47 already tracking toward her center mass. At that range, with her weapon transitioning between targets, she should have been dead. Should have been. The fighter's first shot went wide as Elena Carter threw herself sideways, her own pistol coming up in a move that defied physics and common sense. 3 shots from a weapon that shouldn't have been accurate enough at that range, from a firing position that shouldn't have been stable enough to matter. All 3 shots found center mass. The fighter crumpled backward into the hole he'd emerged from, and the valley finally, mercifully, fell silent. Elena lowered her weapon, scanned once more for threats, then began the careful climb back toward the ridge, where her teammates waited in stunned silence. The medevac helicopter's rotors were still spooling down when Chief Ethan Cole finally found the words he'd been searching for since watching their observer single-handedly dismantle an enemy squad. "Captain," he said, approaching where Elena sat, cleaning her rifle with the kind of methodical precision that left no doubt about her priorities. She looked up from the cleaning rod, her expression giving away nothing. "Ask away. What you did down there?" He gestured toward the now quiet valley where smoke still drifted from positions that would never threaten American forces again. "That wasn't luck. That wasn't even just good training. I've worked with Delta, with DevGru, with shooters who are legends in this community. What I watched you do today," he stopped, shaking his head as if trying to dislodge thoughts that didn't quite fit into his understanding of how the world worked. Elena waited, not offering help, not filling the silence with explanations he hadn't asked for. "How?" he finally said. "How did you do what 3 SEAL snipers couldn't?" She reassembled her weapon with movements that spoke of thousands of repetitions, then looked directly at him with eyes that had seen too much to pretend otherwise. "I wasn't always a logistics officer." "What were you?" A pause long enough for the helicopter crew to finish their post-flight checks and start loading wounded. The person they sent when logistics wasn't enough. Diaz, his arm in a sling but his curiosity intact, leaned closer. "What unit? What command?" Elena Carter's smile was barely visible, and it didn't reach her eyes. The kind that doesn't exist on organizational charts. She stood, slinging her rifle across her chest with practiced ease. "Your men did good work today, Chief. They adapted. They supported. They kept fighting when things went sideways. That's what matters." But Cole wasn't ready to let it go. "Captain, with respect, we need to understand. You need to understand that sometimes the person who looks like they don't belong is exactly the person you need." She cut him off, not unkindly, but with a finality that brooked no argument. And sometimes the best way to win a fight is to have someone the enemy doesn't see coming. The helicopter crew chief gestured that they were ready for passengers. Elena picked up her small rucksack and walked toward the bird, moving with the same unhurried precision that had characterized everything she'd done since stepping off the truck that morning. As she reached the aircraft, Hayes, his shooting arm bandaged but functional, caught her attention. He pulled a spent brass casing from his pocket, one that had ejected from her rifle during the firefight, and held it out to her. "Keep that," she said, not taking it. "Remind you that sometimes you need to change the rules to win the game." She climbed aboard without looking back, settling into a seat near the door where she could watch the valley grow smaller as they gained altitude. Below them, the pass that had been a death trap for American forces was now just another stretch of a Rocky Mountains cape, empty and peaceful under the climbing sun. The SEALs sat in contemplative silence during the flight back to base, each man processing what he'd witnessed in his own way. They'd been rescued not by superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but by a woman they'd assumed was there to watch them work. Lopez, staring out the window at terrain that looked exactly like every other valley in Iraq, finally put words to what they were all thinking. "We're never going to see her again, are we?" Diaz shook his head slowly. "People like that don't stick around for debriefs and after-action reports. They just disappear." Hayes sat across from where Elena had been seated, studying the empty space like it might give up secrets. His team was alive because someone had intervened when conventional tactics failed. Someone who'd walked down into a kill zone alone and emerged victorious against impossible odds. Someone who'd never been supposed to fire a shot. The brass casing Hayes still clutched in his good hand caught the light streaming through the helicopter's windows. Later, he'd have it engraved with a single word: respect. Not because she demanded it, but because she'd earned it in the only currency that mattered to professionals who dealt in life and death. And in the valley they'd left behind, wind began to scatter the evidence of what had happened there. Spent brass, blood on stone, and the lingering echo of precision that had saved American lives. But the lesson would remain, carved into memory by the sharp edge of experience. Never assume that the quietest person in the room is the least dangerous. Sometimes they're just waiting for the right moment to remind everyone what real professionals look like when the stakes matter most. Have you ever completely misjudged someone based on appearances only to discover they were exactly what the situation needed? What would you have thought watching those elite snipers miss shot after shot while she hit every target perfectly? Do you think there are people like her walking around in everyday jobs hiding skills that could change everything in a crisis? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that the most dangerous people are often the ones you'd never suspect, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about hidden warriors. Share this with someone who knows that quiet professionals get the job done while everyone else is still talking about it. More stories about heroes hiding in plain sight are waiting on your screen. Watch those next, and we'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that appearances can be deceiving. Until then, remember, the wolf doesn't announce itself to the sheep.